The case of Caster Semenya is a difficult one. This is the South African athlete with elevated levels of testosterone due to a medical condition that would appear to give her an advantage when competing. And the point has been made that athletes such as Michael Phelps have an advantage due to their genetics. Michael Phelps, for example, his body produces a freakishly low amount of lactic acid, which makes him great at swimming, and he's celebrated for that. So why is Caster Semenya being punished for elevated levels of testosterone? And it's meant that she's been told she will be unable to compete unless she takes hormone suppressing drugs to keep her levels of testosterone to an acceptable amount. Now, there's various factors here. The first question would be, why do we have male and female events when it comes to sport anyway? Why not just let everyone compete, every man, every woman, for themselves, and whoever comes out on top comes out on top? Well, that's because of the unfair advantage that men have due to their physiology. And if we did things like that, almost every Olympic event would be won by a man. The other question to ask is, how many genders are there? It's a question that gets asked a lot today, and the people saying that Caster Semenya should be allowed to compete against other women untreated are often the type of people that will tell you there are many genders, it's not just male and female, and this has become a left-right split for some reason, like most issues these days. And people will say, no, there are many genders, but the reality is that gender, which is not the same as sex, but it is related, is a broad spectrum with female at one end, male at the other. And biologically, Caster Semenya has a condition known as intersex. So her physiology contains elements of what we regard as the male body, male organs, and female organs. Obviously, she's grown up as a woman and has therefore been competing in female-only events, and why wouldn't she? But if we acknowledge that gender is a broad spectrum and that there are people born intersex in that they have the physiology of both male and female, and that there are advantages when it comes to competing in sport with having male characteristics, then why not create more sporting events, more sporting categories for these places on that spectrum between male and female? It's not a controversial thing in sport to have different categories for different levels of ability or levels of weight. For example, when I won the British University Amateur Boxing Championship in 2005, late 2005, I did so as a welterweight, and the weight limit in those days was 69 kilos. I don't know if it's changed now, but had they just made it an open class free-for-all and said, right, anyone of any weight can come and get in the ring, I don't think I would have stood much of a chance against the heavyweights. But at 69 kilos, I won a gold medal. So why not have different sports categories in the Olympics for people, for women in particular, with different levels of testosterone. And I'm sure that of all the people in the world with that condition, Caster Semenya will probably still be the best. But then again, where do we draw the line? And we do have different categories for male and female. In the Paralympics, there are various categories. I remember watching it 4 years ago. We've missed the Paralympics this year and the Olympics, unfortunately, due to the pandemic. But you had T1, T2, different categories for people with different levels or different types of disability. And before he horrifically murdered his fiancée on Valentine's Day, Oscar Pistorius was a world champion Paralympian, and he used to compete at the Olympics as well. He would compete against para-athletes, but also against able-bodied athletes, and there was debate about whether or not his artificial limbs were actually a hindrance or an advantage. And as a spectator, it's very easy to just say, oh, just let him get on with it. Sport is meant to be inclusive, it's meant to be about everyone. But when you're losing out on a gold medal by 0.01 of a second, I guess it's hard to be quite as compassionate. And I did see an interview with a British athlete who had run a personal best, I think in the Olympics semi-final possibly, and she'd lost out to Caster Semenya, and she felt very begrudged by the advantage that this athlete had over her. And maybe the only way is to ask Caster Semenya and other similar people to take the hormone suppressing drugs, but it seems very, very unfair on her and quite a strange thing to do. Usually we're telling people not to mess around with drugs when it comes to sport. And there are other advantages that certain groups of people have in sport over others, and it would be deemed very, very unacceptable to start splitting up sports categories on those grounds. I mentioned before the weight categories in boxing. No one has a problem with that. I don't think it's reasonable to let a 70 kilo guy get in the ring with a 100 kilo guy. He might take his head off. But what about the perceived advantages that some ethnic groups have in, for example, sprinting? We mentioned this the other day on one of the live streams. The 100 meters is almost always won by an individual of West African descent, very often American or Afro-Caribbean. Not as simple as saying black people have an advantage in sprinting, but black people who descend from West Africa have won the vast majority of sprinting events for the past 50 years. Now that would seem to be due to, in part, certainly genetics. I think it would be very hard to argue otherwise. What are we going to do? Start having a 100 meter sprint for black people, 100 meter sprint for white people, another one for Asians? That would be very unacceptable, and it's quite a repulsive idea, especially when you consider all that the Olympics represents. The fastest movement of his life, and it's still a superb achievement. So maybe getting to the Olympics, running a personal best, and even if you still finish behind Caster Semenya, who has this amazing, God-given, natural advantage, maybe that's still a moment to be very proud of. But for a female athlete who's trained all her life for that one moment, to feel that she's missed out because someone has an unfair advantage, it's difficult. Must be difficult to deal with. Anyway, let me know what you think in the comments. Should Caster Semenya be competing against other women with her full testosterone levels? Or should she be forced to take the drugs? Or should we have other categories in sports now that we've recognised that there are more than two genders?